Mayo Clinic presents
Emergency Medicine Grand Rounds.
Hello and welcome to the Always On EM podcast. My name is Venk. I'm one half of the duo that is behind this show. The other half is Dr. Alex Finch. You could argue he's the better half. And you are joining us mid-month, mid-February 2023. Amazing how much of the year has already passed. And if you're like me, you enjoyed the Super Bowl just recently and are ready to learn something else. And that is why we are bringing you another Grand Rounds episode. Today, we have a special guest from Emory University, and I want to share a little bit of the background behind how we decided to invite her. In particular, we have a wonderful training program here at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and it's wonderful because of the people. In this case, two relevant people, two of our trainees, Dr. Rebecca Leff and Dr. Giju Lim, reached out to me to say, hey, we want this particular speaker to come talk to us because we think they have experience and a mindset and a skill set that we don't hear enough of and we need to hear more about. And I couldn't agree more with them, especially after I heard the talk. After listening to this person's Grand Rounds, I was sitting and thinking about what I thought I knew about immigrant health and those who might be disenfranchised in healthcare here in the United States, and reevaluating all of that because of the content and the passion with which this speaker gave her talk. And I was immediately certain that I needed to share this with the world, with all of you. And so it is an incredible honor to introduce Dr. Amy Zeidan to all of you. She lives to serve the people most in need and has demonstrated that consistently. She's currently assistant professor at Emory University School of Medicine and works clinically at the landmark Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. She got her medical degree at George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences and did an emergency medicine residency at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. She completed an ultrasound fellowship at the University of Kentucky and is currently co-director of the Georgia Human Rights Clinic and co-founder of the Society of Asylum Medicine, and has conducted forensic medical evaluations for more than 60 asylum seekers, including those who are detained. Her research focuses on barriers to acute care for refugees, immigrants, and asylum populations. She works closely with many local community organizations to advocate for improved access to medical care for immigrant populations and the release of medically vulnerable individuals from detention facilities. She is an active member of the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine's Academy for Women in Academic Medicine, serving on their executive board for over 4 years, and additionally has interests in gender inequities in academic medicine. Overall, like I said, she has devoted her life to uplifting those that are impoverished or disenfranchised by systemic care or systems in general. And it is an incredible honor and pleasure to learn from her and listen to her as she spotlights immigrant health. Of course, I'm not blind to the fact that when we talk about immigration and immigrant health and the care of people who are in need, sometimes personal beliefs, faith, and politics can get involved, and that can create tension. I would ask everyone to come to this table or this virtual table with the mindset that we have a unifying goal, which is to uplift the healthcare of the people that share this world with us. And if we keep that unified and shared vision in mind, I think we can all learn a lot from Dr. Zeidan, regardless of our personal background and beliefs. As always, as you're listening to this and other pieces of content from Always On EM, if you find it valuable, we would greatly appreciate it if you could tell others around you about the podcast so that they can listen too. And don't forget to like, comment, and follow us on whatever platform you're using. Okay, without any further delays, Dr. Zeidan, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you all. This is a topic that is very important to me, and I'm excited to share some of the things that I have learned over the past many years about the health and health rights of immigrants. I want to say a special thank you to you all for letting me be here virtually. As much as I love the Minnesota winters, having grown up in southern Minnesota. I recently had a baby who's now getting much older. And so it makes traveling right now very difficult. So a huge thank you for your accommodation. Again, I'll be back to Minnesota very soon, hopefully. I have no disclosures, but I do want to say that I am talking about the health and health rights of immigrant populations, but I do not have the lived experience. I am not a former immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker. Much of what I have learned is from doing evaluations, forensic evaluations with asylum seekers, working in our clinics for immigrant populations, and learning from those who have the lived experience. So my content expertise on this is not based on that. Therefore, I actually can't call myself a content expert, but I think that's important to sort of recognize as we get started. So the objectives that were shared with you that we'll discuss include exploring the socio-political context of the U.S. immigration system, including immigration detention, discuss the barriers to care faced by immigrant populations, and consider the role of EM physicians in supporting the health rights of immigrants, both in the emergency department and outside of the emergency department. So I like to start this talk with just thinking about definitions and pathways. And really the best way to say this is it's really complicated. So I think, what we hear about sort of in the news and in the media are terms that are used interchangeably, even though they're not necessarily interchangeable. So I want to start out just kind of going through a few of these terms. And again, these are not terms that I have picked or that I support, but they're really based on a legal framework, which is sort of how immigration has been designed in this country, for better or for worse. And so a lot of these define a legal status or a legal pathway and may not be the most person-centered terminology, but I think it's important that we sort of recognize what these terms mean and sort of how they're used, just so we really understand what that means in terms of healthcare access, and how that applies to us in the emergency department. So generally, we kind of use the term immigrant, migrant, foreign-born to describe anyone who was born outside of the United States who has migrated to the United States. Somebody who is unauthorized or undocumented means that they do not have a legal status at that time. Somebody who has refugee status has been designated refugee status in a different country, meaning they applied while they were in their home or host country, were granted refugee status, and arrived to the United States on that refugee status, which is a protected status, and accessible for that person to become a green card holder, a permanent resident, and then a naturalized citizen. Whereas an asylum seeker is also someone that is similar to a refugee in that they have faced persecution for a variety of reasons, but they aren't granted or may not have applied for refugee status prior to coming to the United States. So that person enters and has to go through asylum proceedings, which can take many years and is quite complicated, and really the percentage of approval for those who then become asylees is quite low. And so an asylee is then someone who has actually been granted asylum status after an oftentimes many-year process. You may hear about U visa, T visa, VAWA cases. U visas are for those individuals who have have not a non-legal status, who are a victim of a crime, and go through court proceedings to then be protected under that status. T visa are for those individuals who are survivors of human trafficking. And VAWA cases are violence against, it's violence against women, but it's not specifically for women, but it's essentially somebody who has been victimized in a relationship and has protected status in the United States. And then there's all these other statuses that we hear about that we won't go into great detail, but really the emphasis is that they're they're temporary, they're not permanent. And so many of these are in limbo, or mean that this person can have a temporary protected status for a few years, and then that's a bridge to something else. But oftentimes that bridge, as we've seen with DACA, is again temporary, it's not permanent. And then there's multiple different types of visa holders. For those who have a specific status, like refugees, for example, they can then, after a certain period of time, become a permanent resident, and then after a certain period of time, become a naturalized citizen. It's usually 5 years as a permanent resident. So that's just a really, I think, helpful way to kind of think about these terms and how complicated they are. And to complicate things even more, if we look even more closely at the asylum process, this top line here is specifically to the refugee process, which we've talked about a little bit. And I want to give a shout out to Minnesota as being a very welcoming state to the refugee resettlement process over the last probably 30 to 40 years. Looking up the recent stats, I think you all have over 100,000 resettled refugees in the state. And again, are kind of notoriously known in a good way throughout our Society of Refugee Healthcare Providers as being a very welcoming and innovative state for resettlement. So the last three pathways here really focusing on the asylum process. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but I think it kind of helps display the complicated process of this. I want to focus on kind of what happens at the border, because that's where we're hearing a lot of things in the news and have for the last many years. So the affirmative process is essentially somebody that enters on a valid visa, whether it's a visitation or a work visa, and those are honestly quite unlikely. Those are really hard to get. And for most people fleeing persecution, that is not something that you can easily come by. So if you kind of think about how this works at the border, when someone is fleeing persecution and enters at a U.S. border, in the past, what happened is they would undergo a credible fear interview and then usually would be released, not to a detention center or back to a different country, but released to await their trial, their proceedings. And what we've seen happen in the last few years is a lot of sort of unfortunate changes to this process. One being that the credible fear interview typically is done by trained asylum officers, and we've seen sort of less trained asylum officers doing these credible fear interviews and sometimes denying people and deporting people quickly. We've also seen that a lot of people are forced to go to immigration detention facilities with the increased use of immigration detention. And those facilities are often sort of deportation machines. And there's some concerns that the cases that go through the immigration court are, again, not really allowed a fair trial and don't really have great access to legal representation. So that's kind of the pathway. And again, I just wanted to highlight those important things because it just gets really complicated. And I think it's important that we understand the context of the environment that some of our patients coming to us may have experienced. Okay, so now for an even more complicated process, I really like this framework, thinking of sort of the sociostructural context, because it helps us better understand when we're taking care of this population and these individuals. It helps us better understand what got them to that point and what the barriers are they face sort of in the real world when they leave the emergency department. So one thing I think is really important is to think big and to think about the system and structures of our immigration system and really how they have allowed for or forced the exclusion of immigrant populations from many of our political, economic, and social policies. So I'm going to give you a few examples of this. Thinking about both social, economic, and political policies. During COVID, the COVID-19 relief packages that were released by the federal government had stipulations, so most immigrant populations did not receive those benefits. So this is an example of, a population experienced the same difficulties as all of us during COVID-19 plus more, and were excluded from the very benefits that many of us had access to. Another example of this is a little bit more focused but interesting, is the sort of recent federal policy or executive order in which the Biden administration excused or exonerated those who had possession of marijuana and were in justice involved or incarcerated because of that. But this did not apply to immigrant populations. And finally, where I live is home to me in Georgia. There are a number of really harmful policies, but one that I see not infrequently is that those who don't have legal status don't have access to a driver's license. And so what that means is they can't drive. And that can be a really challenging and stressful situation, especially during COVID-19. And what we saw with some of our populations is that they were forced to use public transportation, even though it was unsafe, or they were forced to drive in unsafe conditions, sort of taking back roads so that they were avoiding any sort of law enforcement. And if they then did get into a car accident, oftentimes those patients were then entered into this sort of detention, deportation proceedings. So I think it's a really helpful way to kind of think about the big structures and systems of immigration that our patients face outside of the hospital, outside of the emergency department. And then if you look a little bit more narrower, thinking about social or structural determinants of health. So those are the things that affect where we live, work, and play. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, but that's kind of the more neighborhood effect of immigration alone being a social determinant of health. And then finally, thinking even more focused on sort of the individual, when we think about the term structural vulnerability, essentially what that means is that there is bias and disadvantage towards certain groups, which leads to exploitation and discrimination. And so this is kind of the framework that I think about in terms of many structurally vulnerable populations, but immigrants especially, to understand how have these populations been excluded from, healthcare, and how has that led to what we're seeing in the emergency department and the barriers that they face when they leave. So in thinking about kind of the systems and structures, I think another important thing is just looking at the last 10 years in which the discussion has been a lot more hostile. Under the Trump administration alone, there were over 400 anti-immigration related executive orders. This is, again, another example of kind of the socio-political structures that impact immigration, and really how that impacts people on an individual level is with fear. And what we heard from a lot of our populations during COVID and during the last few years is that they were afraid to seek care because of the sort of anti-immigrant sentiment that was present in the United States at that time and still is. And then again, kind of going to that next circle, thinking about immigration as a social determinant of health, this impacts your access to so many things. So the first being access to healthcare, which is really related to whether or not you have access to health insurance, which we'll talk a bit more about, I believe, on the next slide. Access to public benefits. So as I mentioned, during COVID-19, having access to the sort of COVID-19 relief packages, but this extends beyond that. In fact, if you look at many social programs, particularly in the state of Georgia, a lot of the funding for these social programs has a tiny asterisk in which immigrant populations or those without legal status are excluded from that funding. Access to safe employment is a huge one. So for those who don't have legal status, oftentimes they're forced to work in environments that they can easily be exploited or made to feel that they don't have rights. And that's not actually true under OSHA policies, but it does really force people to work in employment that is oftentimes unsafe. And then kind of thinking about all these barriers and then this sort of financial instability and what that means in terms of where you have access to live based on sort of your socioeconomic status. And that can impact the safety of your neighborhood as well. And then finally, I kind of mentioned fear before, but this is something that we heard a lot from our patients is that when they are victims of a crime or, something bad happens, they don't feel that they have protection. They don't feel that they can come forth to really explain, what happened or to report somebody because they're afraid that they will be discovered. And this unfortunately happened with a few of our asylum-seeking populations in which they were victims of or survivors of intimate partner violence, and they called to report the violent event and were then discovered essentially and went through the deportation proceedings. So now we have a little bit more kind of like a background or a framework that kind of, I think, hopefully helps you understand, those are the barriers that people face outside of the outside of the ER, and how that can then impact the actual barriers to care before even coming to the emergency department. So I like to talk about healthcare access and what that means. And really, I think in this country, your ticket to healthcare access is through insurance. So looking at some of these different populations we've talked about, I wanted to go through what that means in terms of health insurance and health access. So for refugee populations, they have access to something called refugee Medicaid, which is equivalent to regular Medicaid for about 8 months. After that point, they are expected to apply for marketplace insurance or employment-sponsored insurance. There was a study that was done that looked at refugee populations a few years out and identified that many of those populations did not have any sort of insurance for a variety of reasons. One reason being that when their refugee Medicaid is ending, they usually get a notification that says, hey, your Medicaid is ending. Here are your next options. But oftentimes that's in English or, confusing because it can be a paper or an email or something that that person may not understand. And so we've had a lot of our patients say, I didn't understand. I didn't get a notice. I didn't know that this was ending. We've also had a lot of people say, I can't afford insurance through my employer because it's really expensive. So if you take, for example, Clarkston, Georgia, which is a city right outside of Atlanta, where most of our resettled refugee populations live, the average income or the average income for a family of 4 is somewhere between $30,000 to $50,000. And so if you think about taking your financial, any sort of money out of that for insurance, many people opt out of it because they say they couldn't afford it. So that's just kind of, I think the confusing process where it's, yes, you do have access to insurance, but like, what is that theoretical access? And so for a lot of our refugee populations, at least in Georgia, what that means is that based on their type of insurance, the sources of care that they're accessing tend to be federally qualified health centers, free clinics, or county-specific clinics, county-specific hospitals like Grady. For asylum seekers and those who are applying for other statuses, really you don't have access to insurance until potentially your work authorization, which comes 150 days after application for asylum, which is a long time to go without work and without health insurance. And again, many people may not have access to employer-sponsored insurance. So your health access then, again, similarly, is federally qualified health centers, free clinics, and the emergency department, and potentially emergency Medicaid. And then sort of similarly for those who don't have, who are undocumented, really their access to health insurance is incredibly minimal, depending on what state you are in. In Georgia, we don't have Medicaid expansion. In some other states like California, they do have special programs, but really your access to insurance is so limited that the places that you can access care tend to be federally qualified health centers, free clinics, emergency departments, and potentially emergency Medicaid for those who have more life-threatening conditions. So I think this slide is helpful to think about in terms of access, because what it tells me is that really the access is so limited that oftentimes the emergency department becomes an individual's medical home. And I think we have an opportunity as emergency physicians to really recognize that and advocate for that, because these are the populations that in reality we are frequently taking care of. So I want to transition and talk just a little bit about barriers to seeking care and then barriers to care for populations in the emergency department. And this is based off of a few studies that we did doing qualitative studies with refugee and immigrant populations and hearing from them sort of in their own words, what are the barriers that they have when seeking care? And this is also supported by evidence throughout the literature. So what a lot of our participants told us is that the US healthcare system, as we know, is really complicated. And many people came from countries in which there's no such thing as an emergency department, or they were in a refugee camp for many years, and that was their experience with healthcare. And so that's kind of one of the first barriers, is really understanding, what the US healthcare system is. And many people come to the emergency department not knowing it's an emergency department. And so that can be quite a jarring experience, as the emergency department can be in general, even if even if you are familiar with the healthcare system. Language barriers, as we know, are quite prevalent. And this goes not just to, actual language barriers when you're seeing a patient, but thinking about how someone would schedule an appointment. It's hard for me to schedule an appointment, and let alone, somebody who doesn't have an interpreter present for their phone call. So that can be a huge challenge for people just in terms of scheduling. Our participants also said that access to clinic is really limited based on where they're living, the distance to the clinic, their access to transportation to that clinic, going to a clinic that accepts their insurance, and going to a clinic that offers interpretation. And so what that means is, there may only be a few clinics that have all of those things that you can reliably access. And when we looked at this for our women's clinic at our refugee clinic in Philadelphia, we geo-mapped different clinics to where our patients lived, and essentially identified that where our women patients lived, there were clinic deserts, essentially, that they really didn't have access to women's health in the locations that they lived in. And then access to medications can be really challenging. Some people may not be familiar with prescription medications or sort of how that works, and have financial barriers to medications as well. Access to dental and specialty care is even more challenging, just thinking about the barriers to primary care. And then you add that dental and specialty care oftentimes requires different funding mechanisms, referrals, and even harder to get appointments. And finally, many of our patients said, it's not my priority right now. I just moved to a new country. My health is actually not my priority right now because I feel okay. I feel healthy. And so that can be a challenge, especially when your insurance is sort of limited to the first 6 to 8 months for refugee populations. So thinking about barriers in the ED and hospital, and these are more barriers that I think we as clinicians can control. One being interpretation. I think this is not, we're all sort of familiar with this, but I like to think about, it's not just me using an interpreter with my patient, it's everyone. It's, when people come in, oftentimes the registration, the text, everybody that's involved in that person's care may not be using interpretation. And so that makes understanding the encounter really confusing. There's also been studies looking at not necessarily immigrant populations, but non-English speaking or non-English language preference populations, demonstrating that these populations are much more likely to experience adverse events in the hospital, medication errors, longer lengths of stay, more postoperative complications, thereby meaning that the quality of care that these individuals receive is much lower than what we would expect. And then finally, as we've already sort of mentioned, barriers to insurance can really impact somebody's ability to follow up. And even having a place where people can go to follow up can be quite challenging, just as we saw with their ability to identify a medical home or primary care option. Okay, so I've covered, I think, a big framework sort of thinking about the context of immigration in the United States, how that impacts individuals' access to healthcare, how that impacts us and our ability to care for patients. And I want to transition to just kind of end on talking about immigration detention. I can't talk about immigration without talking about detention, because it's, I think, such an widely used and an important part of sort of the experiences, sadly, that many people experience in the United States. So looking at immigration detention over the last 30 years, the number of immigration detention centers has increased dramatically, with a huge rise in the total number of individuals detained. And part of this is because Congress, and through executive orders, essentially mandated a daily status of over 30,000 people detained in facilities every day. And so it gets really complicated in terms of requirements, in that these facilities make money off of holding people in detention, and it sort of incentivizes the use of immigration detention. So we can see that these numbers have continued to go up. And kind of when I went through the pathway before for asylum seekers and those at the border, what we're seeing now is that many people who present to the United States fleeing persecution are more likely to be placed in immigration detention facilities. But this is also true for those who are living in the United States and potentially discovered, who then are sent to immigration detention facilities, and then ultimately, for the most part, kind of leads to deportation. What I think is really important to highlight is that the conditions in detention are equivalent to conditions in prison. They're really awful. The housing is really inadequate. The food is really inadequate. It's terrible hygiene. We saw this during COVID-19, in which many people didn't have access to hand sanitizer or soap and water, didn't have access to masks, weren't able to social distance, were kind of stuck in pods very close to one another. The work conditions are similar, where people are oftentimes forced to work for a very, very low reimbursement rate. And then the detention facilities operate under civil law, which essentially means that you don't have access to a lawyer as one would in a criminal proceedings. And so legal access can be really, really challenging, especially considering that a lot of these facilities are located in rural areas where there just aren't a lot of legal support. And then, as I mentioned before, these are sort of high deportation machines where people are not really afforded due process because they're deported so quickly. And we've seen that a lot recently, especially in individuals who spoke out about conditions and their treatment. So the next bullet point is thinking about sort of medical mismanagement, neglect, and abuse. And I think this is where we come in as clinicians in really thinking about what are the medical rights of individuals in immigration detention and how are those being violated. And so one way we sort of looked at this is we did chart reviews for individuals in detention facilities throughout the Southeast who were referred to us by different legal advocates. And in our review of medical charts, objectively identified a variety of medical neglect and mismanagement, just a few that you can see here. So we found that many people received an incorrect workup for a specific condition, were not appropriately referred to a specialist, received incorrect medications or treatments, and often had, in general, substandard operations in these facilities in which there were significant delays in care, limited oversight, and inconsistent documentation. So one way that I think I try to relate this to the emergency department, because people could say, why as emergency medicine physicians should we care about this? And I think one, because the rights of individuals are being violated, but also understanding the negative experiences that those individuals face in immigration detention and how that impacts their quality of care if they're able to get out, or if your patient has a family member or loved one in detention. But also, we looked at the number of 911 calls from an immigration detention facility in Georgia, and we found that there were actually a lot of calls. So this looked at a 5-year period, publicly available 911 calls. And we looked at how many calls occurred over that 5-year period. We found that in a 1 week period, there were at least 2 to 3 calls per week. So 70% of the days there were no calls, but about 30% of the days there were 1 or 2 calls, which again, there's no great comparison, but I think this is a lot. I think that 2 to 3 calls to EMS a week and then transport to the emergency department means that if you work in a facility close to these detention facilities, you are likely taking care of these patients, and it's important to understand the medical conditions that they face in their facility. So I think that's how, one thing to kind of relate it to the emergency department, given that we're oftentimes caring for these individuals, and the chief complaints or the reasons for the EMS call when we look through them were for high acuity conditions, as you would expect, what we see in the emergency department, chest pain, abdominal pain, syncope, shortness of breath, seizure. Our next step is to look through the actual EMS data to understand the severity of individuals upon arrival, the disposition, the interventions, and then hopefully, if we can, look through ED department databases by payer code to see the outcome of the individuals that were sent to the emergency department and potentially hospitalized. So I'm just curious if you all know if there's any detention centers in Minnesota, because again, you could say this doesn't really apply to us. And I'll tell you, there is actually one facility in Carver County, I think in Chaska. So it's really interesting because ICE has both dedicated facilities where it's just immigrants, and they have what they call intergovernmental service agreements, where they contract with local prisons and jails to hold both immigrants who are detained and those who reside there for criminal convictions. And so interestingly, most states actually have, if it's not a dedicated facility, they do have these IGSA, these agreements with ICE, and many prisons or jails do hold those who are in the immigration detention process. So I would say that the Carver County facility does not have a lot of individuals detained, but they do have a high deportation rate. And I could not access where they came from, whether it was somebody who was living in Minnesota and then was going through the deportation process, or if it was somebody that was transferred to that facility. But again, I think it's important that we are sort of aware of how these facilities function and where they're located, both as sort of a medical rights issue, but also to understand that you may be taking care of these individuals depending on where you practice in the future. And then finally, I'll end with this, and then hopefully we'll have time to discuss and answer any questions. But kind of going back to that sort of big system structure, the sociopolitical context. This is some data that has been done by an amazing organization, BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. But the entire immigration system, if you think about it, is a sort of racialized system, inherent with sort of racist policies and practices. So if you just look at the data here, the percentage of individuals who are Black, who are unauthorized or undocumented is quite small, but the number of those facing detention on criminal grounds is quite high. And some of the reasons for that they have pointed to or explored include racial profiling, which we know often happens. And so kind of thinking about the immigration system being sort of riddled with racist policies is not that surprising, as we can see that play out in who is granted status, whether that's temporary status in the United States or other statuses. We've sort of seen that recently with resettlement processes for those seeking refuge from Ukraine, for example, and from other countries where they were potentially less likely to be granted protected status. So again, I think that's really important to sort of think about when we're thinking about the systems and structures and where our patients fall in sort of the middle of all of these things. I can't leave you without any good resources, because I think these two are really essential resources. Now that I've sort of given you all this information and you're thinking to yourself, what can I do with it? There are some great toolkits that were developed for this reason, really to make your hospital system immigration informed and make it welcoming for immigrant populations. The first toolkit was developed by an amazing researcher who did a years-long study looking at how we can better welcome and protect immigrants in healthcare settings. So this is a toolkit I would highly recommend. We took that toolkit and incorporated some other information that's specific to emergency departments, and created an immigration advocacy toolkit with SAEM, which is also, I think, a really helpful resource and tool to kind of go through and say, we can do X, Y, and Z in our emergency department in terms of operations, in terms of education, and so on and so forth. And so I think this toolkit has a lot of great resources in it. A few that I like to highlight is simply having a committee that's multi-specialty, that's sort of operational, that meets regularly to think about how to make your health system more immigration informed, whether that's having more welcoming spaces or having sort of public and private spaces where ICE officials can't access, that are designated for patient care only, whether that's having a guide, working with your legal team for interacting with ICE officials. There's tons of great resources in this toolkit. And so I would encourage you all to, if you're interested and want to do sort of more, that's, I think, a good place to start. So with that, I'd love to take any questions and discuss further. I know we covered a lot of ground, and like I said, it is quite complicated. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zeidan. That was really wonderful and stuff we don't talk about very often. Folks online, you can just ask, and then in the room, Dr. Hami and I both have mics. Just raise your hand, and we can bring one to you. Dr. Leff, I know you were really interested to have Dr. Zeidan come here. Do you have any thoughts now you had a chance to talk with her?
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to come and do this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I'd be interested to see, since your background being in Minnesota, if you have any specific thoughts in terms of integrating some of these recommendations into emergency departments in Minnesota specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with kind of like a bigger picture and then narrow it more to the emergency department. So as I mentioned, Minnesota has done an incredible job in terms of refugee resettlement. I'm forgetting the website. I think it's based out of the University of Minnesota, but the U of M was actually one of the first to have a course on health for refugee populations. So I think there's already some existing work that has hopefully, infiltrated out of the Twin Cities and into more external sort of sources. But I think, it is at the forefront, I think, of a lot of the sort of policy-minded people in, at least in the Twin Cities, to be thoughtful about the policies and sort of economic and social policies in Minnesota that are welcoming to immigrant populations. One example of that is Minnesota has dedicated grant funding for individuals who were a health professional in their home country, who now face barriers to getting certification for that health profession, whether it be nursing, dentistry, medicine, et cetera. And so they provide funding for individuals who want to obtain US specific certification. And that's just one, I know that's not specific to the emergency department, but I think that's one way that Minnesota has done a really great job in being a leader in this field. I think in the emergency department in Minnesota specifically, it kind of depends on where you work and what the population is. But I would say the first thing to look at is look at your resettlement agencies and understand what are the main populations that they provide services for, whether that's for those who are resettled or those who are resettled as refugees, or those who have who are non-refugees but resettled in the community. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the largest populations are in Rochester, but I think understanding that is really important so that you can make sure that the cultural and linguistic barriers don't exist in the emergency department. For example, if you see that, the Burmese population is highly represented, maybe it would be beneficial, and maybe you already do this, but maybe it would be beneficial for your operations team to work directly with a Burmese specific community organization and have dedicated interpretation, dedicated resources, et cetera, for those individuals when they seek care in the emergency department, and have a sort of transition option for them so that you can contact someone in that organization, or, if they're affiliated with a clinic, to say, we're discharging this person from the ER. Can you make sure that that somebody follows up with them? Another important thing that I think is not specific just to where you practice, but could be done everywhere, are medical legal partnerships. Having a lawyer as part of your medical team can help with a variety of health harming legal needs, but specifically immigration can be one of them, so that you can refer those people, those individuals who are, concerned about their status, concerned about how that relates to insurance. And I'll give you one example of this is in Philadelphia, one of our refugee patients was admitted to the hospital and discharged, and he received a bill after the fact for $70,000, and came to the organization that he was most familiar with and said, "There's no way I can pay this bill. Like I literally want to die because this will ruin me and my family." Were his own words. And with legal support and social work and case management support, they were able to get insurance applied retroactively for him, and was able to, reduce the fee that he had to pay. But these are, I think, medical legal partnerships are really powerful in that sense. Having the advocacy and knowledge of a lawyer as part of the team can be life-changing for a lot of people. So that would be another recommendation.
While we wait for other questions, Dr. Zeidan, I was curious, can you speak to the training program that you've built or that you've supported in Emory? How do you train your residents to be able to care for the underserved even better, in addition to the clinical experiences that you have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our human rights clinic, we started in 2019 and really focused on medical students, I would say, and residents are more than welcome to be involved in the clinic, but I would say sometimes their time is limited, and so we find different ways to plug them in. So our clinic is essentially an asylum clinic where we coordinate forensic evaluations for those seeking asylum. So we work with about 12 different local legal organizations and do coordination so that the client is connected with a clinician who can do a one-time medical, psych, or physical examination to document evidence of prior trauma, torture. And that can be really helpful for somebody's asylum claim. They're 2 to 3 times more likely to be granted asylum if they have that accompanying medical evaluation. So that's just another plug for clinicians to be involved in sort of human rights work specific to asylum seeking populations. So that's one of our main programs. And then the other programs is, we review medical records for medically vulnerable individuals in detention and write a letter highlighting evidence of medical mismanagement if it exists. And so many of our students and residents can help with that. They're paired with an attending or faculty member and write the letter together. And those letters have been successful in getting many people released from detention facilities who are not otherwise getting medical care. So I think there's a lot of programs like that that you can, find depending on where you are. There's, I think, over 30 different asylum clinics affiliated with medical students in the affiliated with medical schools in the United States. So that's one way that we expose learners of all types to this work. We also offer electives in both the 3rd year and 4th year of medical school. And then within our residency program, we have a sort of newish social emergency medicine track where people can do this work and help with some of the operational aspects. So our residents have been really helpful in a lot of the operational components of this. One example was a few of our residents worked with our Grady legal team to develop a guide for interacting with ICE officials. We weren't successful in getting it adopted. It's still out in the limbo kind of area. But we've started somewhere. And some of the residents, again, were responsible for trying to designate specific areas of the emergency department to be more safe places. So individuals felt comfortable, sort of free of ICE or law enforcement in those areas as well.
I'm sorry, Dr. Leff has another comment.
Sorry, I was just gonna the forensic asylum training that she mentioned is actually pretty doable. And if anybody wants resources to complete that, I have always an ongoing list of how to complete that, and so that you can, do that when you graduate residency. So just ask.
And I would put in an extra plug for that, because as emergency medicine physicians, we are experts at evaluating trauma, both acute and chronic. And so I think we are, many clinicians can do this work, but I think we are sort of uniquely positioned given our experience. And so that evaluation, again, is a one-time evaluation in which you interview a client and do a physical evaluation to document physical findings of prior trauma. And it's not, I rely on my emergency medicine skills every evaluation that I do, because you really have to think through the mechanism of injury. How did this person get injured? Most of the time they weren't able to get medical care. So thinking about sort of the long-term sequela of those injuries. So it's really important. As Rebecca said, it is doable. I think if you do the training as a resident and you kind of start learning about it and even maybe shadow an evaluation and then do one, that I think you're more likely than once you finish residency to be comfortable doing those evaluations on your own. And as I mentioned, they're hugely powerful, where someone who has an accompanied medical evaluation is 2 to 3 times more likely to be granted asylum, which is really important considering a state like Georgia, where the approval rate is less than 5%. Although I would say the national average is 30 to 50%. So you're, much more likely to be granted asylum in a different state.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Zeidan, most of all, for advocating with your time and your platforms for the health of our immigrant neighbors. We really appreciate the expertise, even if it's not lived as an immigrant, that you bring to this topic. Listeners, thank you for coming back and tuning in every couple weeks to learn together with Alex and I. We truly appreciate you more than you may realize. We put our hearts and souls into this production because we love bringing great content to you. And please help us out by liking, commenting, following our show on whatever listening platform you're using, and most of all, by telling your colleagues and friends to tune in as well. We love hearing from all of you, so please connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, or via email at alwaysonem@gmail.com. We will return March 1st, 2023, so get caught up on everything so far and be ready to learn some more at that time. Until then, peace out.
The Always On EM Podcast.
Emergency Medicine Grand Rounds.